Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the National Bleav Network. And join me to talk Texans draft targets is an old Bleav Network friend, Joe DeLeone, who co-hosts the First Team podcast, also part of the Bleav Network. It's the place to go for in-depth NFL coverage and college football analysis. Always a pleasure to have you on, Joe.
Yeah, of course. Excited to dive into this draft class. It's starting to ramp up, the lead up to the draft. I know that we're only 4 days removed from the Super Bowl, but I have so many people that keep just texting me even for thoughts on the draft, and it's exciting for me. This is the favorite time of year when we can dig into fixing teams, and hopefully the Houston Texans are one of those franchises that find their guys that could be cornerstones for them to get to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, no question. You see it on social media. Texans fans are ready for the draft as soon as everything ends. What do we need? What can we get? All that sort of stuff.
Right.
And, they're desperate for a guard in this draft. This is a good time to remind everyone what you said, Joe, on this show, both before and after the 2022 draft. It was right before, right after. You said it wasn't like you were high on Kenyon Green, by the way, but you said Kyle Hamilton was the best prospect in that draft. The Texans had Hamilton on the board at 13, but traded down 2 spots with the Eagles to pick 2 fourths and a 5th up in the draft as well. They chose Kenyon. We know how that went. The Ravens grabbed Hamilton at 14. He's been all pro the last 2 seasons. So I think you got this one right, Joe. I know you like Kenyon, but still that was pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that there's still some redeemability there, but the bigger problem now, because hindsight's 2020, that we can look back and think everybody should have drafted Kyle Hamilton. Naturally, safeties are going to get overlooked. There's a guy in this class, Malachi Starks, who I think is going to get equally as overlooked from Georgia. But the way that the Texans move on here and the way that they improve is they need to prioritize the offensive line. This is a really good interior offensive line class. There were so many issues that we saw, especially in the playoff game that they lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. That to me was like the firmest evidence that the Texans need to, in their early draft picks in the first 3 rounds, they need to get somebody that can be a quality contributing starter. And again, luckily for them, this is a pretty strong guard and center class that they could probably maybe grab somebody early and then somebody a little bit later on that could be a quality backup or a eventual project to start down the line.
I'm betting the house that guard or wide receiver is the position that they're going to draft in the first round. And it's not just because they need one of those guys, but they need probably 2 in each of those positions. And since we were talking guard, the fan base salivating over Tyler Booker, but is there any legit scenario he's still there at 25? And are there guards you'd consider right there where they are at 25?
I think that Tyler Booker is definitely still capably at that spot for them at the end of the first round. I haven't really feel like I've heard a lot of love or buzz for Tyler Booker this cycle. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because Alabama didn't finish the season very strong, but you flip on his tape, he's everything that you're looking for. He's got a big, wide frame. He's got this Mauler's mentality. He will run you over, and then he's got the flexibility and the feet to move in pass protection really well. The definition of ideal guard prospects, we're looking for guys that in a narrow window in a phone booth are going to be able to win against either big body defensive tackles or maybe some twitched up edge rushers in certain sub-package situations. And he has those tools that you're looking for to compete with both of those guys. Outside of that, though, if Tyler Booker ends up being off the board, there's 2 names that I would pay attention to. Gray Zabel, who was a Senior Bowl darling, who's coming from North Dakota State, who's a big riser in this class. And then Jonah Sabanea, the interior offensive lineman from Arizona, who had a little bit of a shaky Senior Bowl performance. Zabel's going to continue to move up because he fits the description of what we typically see from these North Dakota State guys. He is very physical. He's very downhill. He was playing tackle for North Dakota State, and he just exudes the mentality that you're looking for somebody who's going to be impactful against the run. Savanea is an underrated athlete, and I'd be curious to see what his testing numbers are going to be like. For how massive he is, he moves really well. Another player that projects best that was playing tackle and is eventually going to move inside. But both those options are worthy of going in the back end of the first round. And if that ends up being the Texans pick, I would feel pretty good about it because both have that potential to be early impact contributing starters.
What are the best wide receiver options right there at 25?
One guy that I really love that I think is not getting enough recognition is Matthew Golden from Texas. I think that there's going to be a lot of aggressiveness to go and get Tedero McMillan from Arizona, to get Luther Burden from Missouri. And Emeka Ibuka floats in there. Maybe he ends up being a second rounder from Ohio State. But Matthew Golden is the guy that I think could play really well amongst the current group, because you've got Nico Collins, who is the alpha of the room. You've got Tank Dell when he comes back from his injury, who is extremely explosive and fast. Golden, to me, is the very well-rounded third option that would slide in. It doesn't require significant targets in order for him to get into a rhythm. He is a fluid, easy route runner. He is a guy who has very consistent hands and has shown an ability to make some pretty difficult body contorting catches. I really like that thought of Matthew Golden ending up with the Texans if they are not in love with the guards that are at that spot.
You do not have to tell Houstonians about Matthew Golden. I mean, it was a big blow when he went from U of H to Texas. You saw what he did with Texas. I do want to speak to Luther Burden for a second, because I've seen Texans fans, and I'm sure people are projecting potentially Luther Burden there. As a Mizzou fan, as somebody that's watched the whole thing unfold at the University of Missouri, this guy gets hurt a lot. He's on and off the field a lot. He's got injury concerns consistently. Not a big guy, of course. You look at his build, but also some personality issues a little bit. You know, he's a little bit of a combustible guy. I just don't see, with what the Texans have gone through with Tank Dell and with what the Texans have with D'Amico Ryans and his personality, that they would be interested in somebody like Luther Burden.
And I also just don't know if that's like really a true perfect fit in that room. I think that Luther Burden needs to be picked somewhere to be the primary option. His lack of performance this year was disappointing. There was a hope that he was going to take a huge step forward after he had a great sophomore season. But I would think that where he's this yak guy who needs a lot of touches to get into a rhythm, that he would need to go somewhere that he maybe isn't the wide receiver one, but is the second option at the bare minimum. With an already crowded room, it feels like it would be much better for Houston to go with somebody who doesn't need to be fed early and often. And frankly, I think for the Texans, it would make a lot more sense for them to prioritize receiver somewhere on day two, because there are some pretty strong options for them if they wanted to go with a guy like Alec Ayomanor, who is a steady route runner, or somebody who I'm really excited about, Jaden Higgins from Iowa State, who is a height, weight, speed freak who can move really well in and out of his cuts on his routes and has shown an ability to also make some difficult catches. So there are some pretty good options on day 2 and day 3 that they could turn to if they don't get this accomplished in the first round.
Yeah, we're going to get to day 2 and day 3 in a second. By the way, if you're watching, listen to this, I want your comments on YouTube. Who do you guys think? What position group? Who do you like in the draft? Let us know. The only other angle the Texans might go in the first round is a little bit of a wild card for me anyway, is tight end, especially since former tight end coach Nick Caley is the new OC. Is there a couple of tight ends you like late first?
It depends on who's on the board, but I think that right now we're in this flow for the top 2 tight ends to end up going earlier than 25. And I'm talking about Colston Loveland, who is the Michigan tight end, and Tyler Warren from Penn State, who got a ton of attention throughout this year for how impactful he was. Colston Loveland, very tall, fluid athlete that has great acceleration. He is somebody who doesn't lose any speed on his cuts, less impactful as a blocker. Tyler Warren is going to be a little bit better as a blocker, but he was doing everything for Penn State. He's going to test really well at the combine. I think a lot of people don't realize that he is a very, very athletic dude. I believe he was listed over 250. Big frame, is able to make a lot of difficult grabs like we saw this year at Penn State, and can do a lot after the catch as well because he is a good athlete. But outside of those 2 guys, I wouldn't select any of these other tight ends in the first round. There's a pretty good chance, just looking at the board, knowing how many teams ahead of the Texans right now need to find their next tight end. And like the Chargers, easy example of a team that need a tight end. The other team that comes to mind, the Indianapolis Colts, they need to find a consistent go-to option at tight end for Anthony Richardson. With so many different teams possibly prioritizing that position, could make it difficult for Houston to address that.
You mentioned San Diego, or I say San Diego, LA. It's I just make that mistake every single time. But the Chargers, they might like Colton because Harbaugh coached him, right, at Michigan. So those guys know each other. Yeah, important also to note, Nick Caserio, director of player personnel, when the Patriots chose Rob Gronkowski, not in the first round, in the second round at 42. Travis Kelce, hey, he was a third round pick, so you never know what's going to happen with tight ends. I want to ask you about the second round in just a sec, but before we roll on, our listeners will have a blast playing Underdog Fantasy. Underdog has a unique approach to fantasy sports with their simple pick'em style format. You can select players you know will outperform expectations without the traditional daily fantasy drawbacks. And if you're a fan of drafting your own guys, which many fantasy owners feel is the fun part, Underdog has simple drafts where you can select a team and compete for serious cash. You'll find all the major leagues and college sports on Underdog. Plus, it's user-friendly, making it easy and fun to play. Why not start right now by clicking the link you see in our episode description and using the promo code HOU. It's right there, too. If you do come aboard, you get a free pick and up to $1,000 in bonus cash. Not a bad deal. So go check out Underdog and download their app to your favorite mobile device. All right, Joe, the Texans' next pick is at 56. Who do you like at that spot? And we can start with guards or wide receivers, whichever one you want to do.
Yeah, I think that as I mentioned earlier, the receiver options, I talked about Jaden Higgins. I really like him. I talked about Alec Manor. Jalen Royals is another receiver coming from Utah State who is another dude, great route runner, would fit nicely as a third option in a receiving room. He got hurt at one point during the season and wasn't able to finish the year. But we saw at the Senior Bowl, the route running when he was placed in one-on-one situations in those drills during the Senior Bowl. But when we start to move on and look at some of the other guard options for Houston, they're not as exciting as the guys that I pitched for the first round, but there's still some pretty good names to pay attention to. I do really like Donovan Jackson from Ohio State. He played a lot of tackle this year because they dealt with a lot of injuries, but when he's played inside at guard, he has shown the physicality, the power, the leg drive to be a strong run blocker and the base to be a strong pass protector. And then somebody who maybe not in the second round, but a little bit later to pay attention to, Charles Grant from William & Mary, who could play tackle, could play guard, just depending on a team's needs. He is really flexible. He is really underrated. I think that he deserves to get a lot more love and somebody who could test really well at the combine.
All right, let's go to third round because safety Kalen Bullock was a third round home run for the Texans last year. And I'd love to see Caserio do it again, grab a safety to complement Bullock since Jimmy Ward's missed 15 games the last two seasons. He's always off the field with injury. Will there be a good safety option at pick 89?
The safety class is very volatile. There's three guys to me that lead the top of the discussion and two that are worthy of going in the first round, Malachi Starks and Nick Emenwari. But the day two options really start to thin out. If there were two guys that could be somewhere on day two, second or third round, Xavier Watts from Notre Dame and Andrew Makuba from Texas, both were really productive this year. Xavier Watts is a former receiver who plays the ball in the air like a receiver. He's got great hands. He's very productive at turning balls over. He needs some improvement still in his ability to track and play in pursuit of, trying to find the football. He sometimes completely misfires on his angles, trying to come down a hill, and that leads to bigger plays after the catch. But the way that he is aggressive and the vision that he has, the anticipation that he has to make plays on the football alongside Bullock could work well. Makuba's another dude who's just super experienced and has a ton of reps under his belt, where he played at Clemson, which was a great, well-coached defense, and then he played at Texas this past year. He's somebody who tackles really well. He flies, goes 100 miles an hour. He's not afraid to hit people. Again, those are two guys that I think that could play really nicely off the skill sets of Bullock if they were selected either in the second or third round.
What positions are the real depth in the fourth round? If there's a steal at running back, the Texans need depth behind Mixon. So that's somebody or a position group anyway that I would consider.
Yeah, the two that I think are the deepest going into the fourth round, sorry, the three actually, running back, as you just mentioned, their defensive tackle and edge. There's going to be a lot of really good starting defensive tackles that are picked maybe in early on day 3, even late on day 3, as well as with edge. But running back's really interesting because it allows for this year, I think, a lot of teams to prioritize certain skill sets that they like and to go after whatever it is to play with among their current group, or maybe even to be their lead back. There are guys that could go late on day 2. They could be 1,000-yard rushers. I think that with this draft class at running back, it's going to be unique in the sense that there's going to be players that are drafted way higher than maybe some people expect, just because the team is prioritizing like, hey, we need a guy that plays alongside our current guy really well, where we need this type of a skill set that we're turning to. But in the 4th round, 2 guys that I really, really like that could maybe slide a little bit and land in that range. I really like Devin Neal from Kansas. Very patient, awesome vision by him. He is very, flexible and fluid in and out of his cuts. And then I also really like RJ Harvey from UCF, who is a hard runner. He is somebody also who shows really good patience and ability to find open lanes. And once he sees them, he hits them, and he hits them at full speed. This running back class, though, that you could end up, again, you could wait until the 6th round, and you could end up getting a guy who's a strong contributor.
Yeah, you mentioned defensive tackle too. And I know Texans fans would love to get a defensive tackle as well. And they really haven't, it's weird, they haven't invested in it since Caserio has taken over. In fact, the last one they drafted high was Ross Blacklock 5 years ago. Oops. Yeah, that wasn't good. Do you see a defensive tackle in the first 3 rounds that you think maybe if somebody slips, you talked about in the 4th round, but maybe even in the 3rd round that would get the Texans excited?
Yeah, as I mentioned, this is a insanely deep defensive tackle class. The one guy that I really love to point to is Alfred Collins from Texas, who is just really well-rounded. He's going to be a really good run defender. He's a big, strong guy who's going to be really physical. Not a lot of upside as a pass rusher, but has the right mentality, I think, to be just a consistent, steady option defending the run. A little bit later on, and he's not going to test this cycle, Riley Mills from Notre Dame had a really strong finish to the season. He's a massive dude. He's got pass rush upside, as he had a lot of pass rush production at the end of the season before his injury during the college football playoff. He's able to use his frame to create space for himself, and then also has the power to overwhelm a lot of interior offensive linemen. And then a guy that's one of my favorite of this class, I love Darius Alexander from Toledo. I have been hyping him up a ton since I watched him at the Senior Bowl. He's one of those guys that the reason why we pay so close attention to these events is maybe you didn't really know what to expect from a small schooler, but he went to the Senior Bowl and he was unblockable during one-on-ones and during the team drills. And I put on his tape. He's got the frame of Chris Jones. He's got the flexibility and the movement skills of Chris Jones. And he's also got this upside to eventually be a really productive pass rusher in the inside. He, to me, is a bit of not a sleeper, but a high ceiling guy that you could take him on day 2, and then he ends up being a tremendously productive defensive tackle in the NFL. And that would probably be my comp, saying that he's a lot like Chris Jones, who was not a first-round pick.
Do you think the Texans' positional needs, this is a good draft for them as far as, what's available depth-wise at some of those positions?
I think so. And for what we talked about today, to kind of reiterate the main talking points, is that interior offensive line, there's options for them in the first round, but there's also some quality depth that at the very least in this class, you're going to get really nice backups to turn to if things don't go well. Defensive tackle, adding just any talent, rotational guys. There's so many options through all 7 rounds. Running back, you could end up, if you address that early, with a 1,000-yard rusher, or if you address it late, just a really good gadget player that you turn to in specific situations, or somebody who just joins a committee alongside Joe Mixon. And then the last part, the only position group actually for what we talked about with receivers, the only position group that I actually don't feel super excited about, knowing that the Texans like what they're looking for, but what they're specifically trying to get isn't a premier, a Drake London, a future super consistent, steady option to Justin Jefferson that is always in the Pro Bowl discussion because they're just so gifted. Instead, there's a lot of guys that are going to be 3rd, 4th options for teams, and there's not very many of them. So the Texans might need to approach finding a receiver somewhere within the first 3 rounds because it starts to thin out pretty quick.
I can tell you from looking around what Texans fans are thinking, you mentioned two guys they would be super excited about if they're there in the first round, Matthew Golden, Tyler Booker. I mean, if they walk away with either one of those, I mean, this fan base will go crazy because there's a positions obviously they need, but I think they've already fallen in love with those guys. Golden, not only Cougar fans, but Longhorn fans in the Houston area that are also Texan fans. But, Booker is somebody that, has just got everybody fascinated, not just because of his skills, but, from everything I've heard, Joe, this is a really exceptional person, leader, the same type of guy that we saw with Will Anderson coming out of Alabama. Same, I guess, factors that, have nothing to do with football, but just leadership.
Yeah, that's always something that you should be looking for with any prospect, especially the way that we've seen the Texans approach selecting guys. They've gone with a lot of high character guys, and there's been a ton of payoff from young dudes like from Will Anderson, from CJ Stroud, that have all been lauded as high character leaders that know how to rally the troops. So, guys like that, Tyler Booker and Matthew Golden both fit that description of just being really high floor leaders that would just be quality faces to add to the locker room.
It's good to see. We've seen Tank Dell the last few days at a Cougar game, at a Texan game. He was with CJ Stroud sitting next to him. So he's out and about, but I don't know if that recovery is going to happen. Just so many injuries. I know, though, he's going to be pitching some Matthew Golden if he's on the board. They got to be buddies from their days at U of H. So that should be interesting. Again, I want to ask the listeners, what do you guys think? Get in the YouTube comments. And if you're a new fan of the show, support us by subscribing on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Joe, are you guys starting to focus on the NFL Combine? What's it, 2 weeks away now?
Yeah, we'll be at the NFL Combine, so we will be previewing very soon, talking about the expectations for who's going to test really well. But yeah, we're slowly shifting our focus. Next week's going to be talking a lot about expectations now that we know who the full participants are going to be.
How do you guys look at the Combine? When you come out of the Combine, is there much change typically with what you believe?
No, typically no, because we already have an understanding of who's going to be the best athletes. Usually what happens is if you have, and we also usually have testing information from NFL scouts that will share this information with us coming into the college football season of when they went and visited schools during the spring leading up to what was this past college year. But what you usually get if there's guys that have surprising numbers that you're not expecting, or maybe names that you're not super familiar with that are way further down the board that you maybe haven't even given a really deep evaluation for, finding and pinpointing those prospects that are undervalued and unrecognized, to go back and watch them and then determine if the testing numbers and the film match up, that this could end up being a sleeper type of a player. That's where that decision-making comes into play.
He's at Joe DeLeone on X. Go subscribe to The First Team. Great stuff over there, always. And thanks so much for giving us a few minutes, Joe.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And hey, just a reminder, if you're watching on YouTube, you're about to see clickable links to my recent shows, including a Rams insider with great insight into Texans' new OC, Nick Caley. So click that and check that out before you take off.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.